Okay, thank you very much for having me. So I'm David Gavich. I do the entomology work at the Invasive Species Center. So if you ask me some stuff about plants, I might be a little hazy about that, but anything about insects, I'm good to go. The Invasive Species Center is a not-for-profit organization that basically brings together knowledge, technology. We put together different types of webinar series and things like that for all different types of people that want to learn about invasive species, management options for invasive species, and basically what we want to do is spread the word about invasive species and how to prevent them from getting into Canada. I'm going to go over these four insects today. So Asian Longhorned Beetle, which was eradicated from Canada about 10 years ago now. Spongy Moth, which we all have dealt with over not just the pandemic, but as well as Spongy Moth outbreaks in this area. Emerald Ash Borer, just to give a little bit of update on what's going on with that, as well as Wilt, which is a new occurrence to Canada. So the Asian Longhorned Beetle, this is a picture of the Asian Longhorned Beetle here. A lot of people tend to think it looks like the native spotted Sawyer beetles. But this beetle here is, shiny, it's black. It has a number of different white spots all over it. Its main host is maple. It really likes maple in North America. Its other host in Asia is poplar. It likes poplar over there, but in North America, it really has taken to going after maple. So, as everyone's a sugar bush owner, that's not a good. It can also go on many different other trees as well. So there's about 10 genera that it can actually survive on. So this is just sort of an indication here. These are the Sawyer beetles that are native to North America. There's about 6 that are native in Canada, or in Ontario. And so they look very similar to the Asian Longhorned Beetle. A lot of people know them as pine bugs. So these guys are on pines and spruces, as well as balsam fir. So you'll be able to see them sort of around your cottages. Usually they like to go after people. But one of the big distinctions is they have what's called a scutellum, so a white scutellum, which is that arrow is pointing to it, and all of them have that scutellum there, so you can see the differences. So if you get close enough in order to want to take a really close look, then before you squish it, you'll be able to identify it. White mark on the back there. So this was the quarantine zone. So it was suspected to come into Toronto area, probably through some sort of packaging material, untreated wood products like a pallet or something like that, which it came into. And they found it in several different areas around the airport area. So what they ended up doing was just essentially cutting down all the trees in that were related to maples and birches and things like that. This is its current range in North America. Chicago, Ohio, New York. There's 2 instances of New York, and 1 in Massachusetts, as well as they just found another occurrence in South Carolina.
Are they being just as aggressive?
Yes. So in Canada, we were more aggressive than the U.S. In our eradication process. So they're actually having a difficult time because it's been introduced into the forest. So we thankfully caught it in a city, so it was easier to deal with, but they're dealing with it in the forest habitat.
So they can come out?
Yes, that's one of the things we're worried about. So essentially what you're looking for, these are pretty open trees, so they're pretty easy to see. When I actually went down to Ohio this year, which was a really interesting experience because that's where they have it, and they had it all through their bushes there, and you weren't able to see where the exit holes and things like that. Crowns were dying back. You can see branch flagging and things like that. But essentially that's what you're looking for, is whether the crowns are dying. And you're also looking for these things called oviposition pits, as well as exit holes. So these, once you see them up close, they're really easy to see. You know, they're quite large. You can stick a pencil through some of these holes. They're pretty easy to distinguish. And the oviposition pits, especially around this time of the year, they tend to sort of have that reddish hue to them, just as the tree is starting to show that coloration. What the female does is she'll chew away some of the bark, and then she'll use her mother and lay an egg right underneath the bark in those areas. So some other symptoms that you might see is external bark cracking. So these two pictures here are just a loosening of the bark, and the other one is like an opening to a gallery. The bottom picture is an opening to the gallery. And then the picture on the left-hand side is essentially what the feeding looks like for the adults if they do end up feeding on the males. So these are some pictures that I took from Ohio. The picture with my finger in it, that's oviposition pit. So I took the bark away, and you can sort of see that. I'll show you this. You can see my mouse here. Right here is an actual egg, and then the larva sort of moved in and started eating from there. So that's one of the things that you would see. This one has lots of exit holes on this bark, and then this is a cross section of a branch, and this is where one of the beetles actually excavated this one branch. It wasn't a very big branch. It was probably about like maybe 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter, but you know, it still made a pretty sizable chunk through there. One of the big things about management right now is Canada's being very aggressive on management. So they still are doing the wood inspections in the Toronto area to make sure that no more occurrences happen. So in 2003 to 2007, they actually did a very extensive eradication process. So there's 665 trees that were found in the Mississauga area. And they basically took all those trees down twice, chipped them in order to make sure that there's nothing left in them. Essentially, they took down almost 30,000 trees in that area to make sure that they got rid of them all. They did the inspections over the next 5 years, and they declared it that they eradicated. They continued on with their inspections and found one tree that was behind a warehouse that no one had caught because it was just a Manitoba maple or box elder. I can't remember the other Manitoba maple, and it was essentially full. So they cut that down and got rid of it as well. So if you were to find a suspect tree, they would quarantine it about 800 meters diameter, and they would do an inspection. What they're actually doing in Ohio is they are employing climbers to essentially scale every tree in a forest stand and look for holes of suspected areas. So it's very labor intensive in order to try to detect this.
Is there compensation?
Not this time. No, I don't think so. I would have to double check on that.
Do you mean in the United States or what, or for the
No,
Canadian program?
they take the tree down, are they gonna compensate?
I think there was some relief for some landowners in terms of, certainly not, you mean for the Ontario one? There was some relief, but I don't know what the compensation was.
Yeah.
But it's basically they have the right and authority to do that as an eradication process.
But if they order that for animals, they'll compensate.
So Good question.
It's a good question for the Canadian Food. I don't have the power to give that answer. Some new research that we are actually looking at right now is we're trying to see if we can detect insects' DNA in maple syrup sap in order to see if we can use it as an early detection method. What's called environmental DNA is mostly used for a lot of different types of invasive species detection work, but it's usually used for the aquatic side of things because environmental DNA is very hard in order to catch in the wilderness because it's easier to flow through water and things like that. Whereas if you can think about it in a forest, an insect isn't going to every single tree and leaving a little bit of DNA everywhere. So what we're trying to look at is, can we detect any type of insect's DNA from sap production? So that's one of the new data that we're trying to look for at this time. So this is another picture I took from Ohio, and this was 2 years ago, it was a 90% maple stand, and now it's essentially an open field because they had to do an eradication process. So this is the kind of management strategy that unfortunately has to be done with this beetle. So that's why we want to prevent it from coming into Canada as much as possible. This is essentially, you can see, I think there's some leftover ash and some shagbark hickory and an oak or two, essentially. But this was I think it was 9% red maple stand right next to an area that sort of managed the property. So I'm going to dive into some Spongy Moth information. So what we're finding with Spongy Moth is the population's collapsed. That's good news. So it ramped up in 2000. It sort of exceeded expectations for the amount of defoliation from our historical knowledge. In 2001, it got even worse with roughly 1.78 million hectares of defoliation, which is absolutely mind-blowing in southern Ontario. In northern Ontario, it's a heavier infestation, but in southern Ontario, where there's not a lot of forest anyways, it was a big area, so a lot of people noticed. And thankfully, last year, it was only about 56,000 hectares of defoliation, so it dropped quite significantly. And this year, we're predicting that it's going to be less than that as well. So this is just a map from the 2002 maps for defoliation by the Ministry of Natural Resources. As you can see, in the Bancroft area was where the big blot of red was in 2002, and now it essentially collapsed, and the Spongy Moth is no longer in there. Oh, sorry. There's sort of more lingering populations towards the forest. This was the forecasting model for this year, actually. This year, they were actually able to say that they weren't able to find significant eggs in the Bancroft and Pembroke area. There was some moderate to severe in the sort of Peterborough, area, but essentially, they noticed that a lot of the population was really starting to collapse. In 2021, when they did the survey, this whole map was essentially red in their in their survey season. So essentially, what they're doing is they're going out and collecting and counting egg masses that they're finding on trees, on rocks, and different other types of locations. So. Spongy moth is a really interesting one because management of spongy moth really depends on its life cycle. The best time for management strategies is in late April and mid-June. So these are the identifying features here. So the egg masses, fresh egg masses tend to be this gold color. I tend to think it looks like sort of like a tennis ball style of fuzziness, because people always say it looks fuzzy. So I always think of a tennis ball, but a gold one. And there's usually about 100 to anywhere from 100 to 500 eggs per mass. So that's usually a good thing to look for. And they'll usually be on the underside of trees. So if you look up at a forest stand, you'll usually see them underneath the branches. They want to protect themselves from the wind and the rain and stuff like that. So it's usually easy to see them when you're looking up than it is other places. An old egg mass tends to get this sort of like creamy white color, and you won't get insects out of those. So first in stage larvae, these are the traveling ones, I like to say, because they're so small that they actually can what's called balloon to different areas, so the wind can actually move them from place to place. So usually hilltop areas are good areas that they'll start to feed on first. And then go from there, because they sort of just get blown around by the wind. They have a lot of hairs on them, so it aids in their wind dispersal. Essentially, there's very small, tiny little black caterpillars. And they usually are one of the first things to come out. So a number of years ago, in 2021, we were having them come out in probably the second week of April. I think I saw some people posted on Facebook that they had. So they can come out as early as second week of April, so just almost as maple syrup season is shutting down. When they're in their second instar, they're still very hungry, and it's easier to detect them from these little orange dots that they have on their backs. There's specific glands that are associated with this genera, and then they get into their most recognizable adult stage, which they have the 5 blue dots on the back, as well as the red dots. And they tend to be this gray-white color, but they have a lot of sort of irritating hairs. So if you are doing like different measurements, make sure to cover up, because the hairs will sort of cause rashes and irritation.
So this is what we were calling the gypsy moth, is
Yes. Yes. So this is what was previously known as gypsy moth is now going by spongy moth. Yes. We're taking after the French. They originally call it I can't remember, sponge papillia or something like that. But
Sponges.
yeah. So these are the pupa. Usually you actually can usually see the pupa casings still left on the tree after a couple years. They tend to fall off really easily. I tend to think they look like an adolescent with bedhead, with the little hairs that sort of stick out. They tend to be either a yellow or a white color, but a lot of actually rodents and birds like this stage, because they'll actually go and eat these. However, they usually can hide pretty good, especially along like sheds. I find they really hide underneath the eavesdrops and things like that, and they can be covered under trees as well. This is the female. The females actually are flightless, and they will just sort of move as far as they can crawl. They don't eat anything. Their only purpose is to mate. So they're just waiting for a mate to come and mate with them, and then they lay their eggs. So they're full of eggs. And you can see there's a whole bunch of the females here, and they're just essentially laying their eggs and then falling off afterwards. They're sort of like this creamy white color. They're larger than the males, and they have a couple dark pigments on them as well. The males are brown. They're a little darker brown. Here you can see all 3 stages in this photo here. This one at the bottom. So there's the egg masses, there's a pupa, and then there's 2 mating adults over here. And essentially that's what they're doing. So the spongy moth males, they can fly, and they can fly great distances. So essentially they're the ones that can disperse quite readily. Now, the good thing is Spongy Moth has a lot of different biocontrol agents. So as much as to do management on your own property, there is a lot of biological agents that have been around for a little bit to actually start to go after them. Unfortunately, they had to ramp up in order to combat the last outbreak that we had. But we have several different types of parasites. There's an egg parasite, which is very prevalent in populations right now. So the egg parasite is this little tiny wasp that actually lays their eggs inside the eggs of a spongy moth and will kill them before they actually come out. So usually now I'll see these egg masses come in from the samples from the UNRF, and you'll usually find half of them are parasitized now. There's also wasps that will go after the caterpillars and the pupa as well. But the biggest one is spongy moth are social creatures, so they don't like to wear masks and things like that, so they get viruses really easily. And so there's this virus called NPV, or Lamantium disbar multinuclear polyhedral virus, which is essentially a virus that specifically only goes after spongy moth. And you can see this is what the virus looks like. So if you see these hanging down larvae, that's usually a virus, and it essentially just liquefies them from the inside. And that's how that virus works. But it works really well. This year we actually had a pretty good year for the fungus, because the fungus needs like a wet, not a dry summer. It needs a really wet spring in order to really ramp up its defenses. And this is sort of what happens to the fungus. It actually sort of dries the caterpillar out and prevents them from moving on to different stages. But it really requires damp, wet years in order to do that. So like I said before, the management really depends on what stage of life it is. So if you're at the egg stage, which is the longest stage, so basically from September to April, you can start scraping egg masses and just putting them into like some soapy water for a number of hours, and that will kill them. Dormancy oil will also work, which is used in horticultural practices. Usually you can buy it at different greenhouses and things like that, and that has to be applied during the time when the trees are dormant anyways. So late fall, early spring thing. Different other ways, larvae, you can capture them through sticky band traps or biopesticides as well. Things like BCK will also work. So I heard someone mention spraying for and caterpillar earlier. Yeah, so this is another one that you can use, and I know a lot of people did end up sort of getting together with different woodlot owners or their partners and things like that, and spray sizable woodlot chunks. The pupa, you could really only do one thing, which is hand picking, and then the adults. You can use pheromone traps, but in Canada, pheromone traps are only used for detection. You can only purchase them for detection methods, but they only collect the males anyways. So I just wanted to put this information up. So if you were wanting to do any sorts of spray programs and things like that, you have to consult with a spray company who does sort of either aerial spraying, either with fixed wing or with a helicopter. One of the big things that you have to do though is they do all their planning and everything like that, before March, so you have to have all your information to them. Usually they prefer between November and January because they're planning their season for the next year. So if you can have all your paperwork in order, your permits that you need in order to talk with those spray companies, then that's probably the best way if you are looking to do a spray program. The spray programs are great. It essentially just keeps the foliage on the trees. That's one of the main things that it does. It allows the trees to continue photosynthesis. They don't have to put out a new flush or anything like that. So that's the real benefits of those types of spray programs. So I'm going to touch on emerald ash borer. A lot of areas around here have been already affected by emerald ash borer. So if many of you don't know, emerald ash borer is a metallic green beetle. It's about 1 centimeter in length. I put my laundry out on the line yesterday, or a couple of days ago, and one actually flew and landed on my sheets, and I was like, oh, I know what that is. So they'll go after all different types of ash trees. So we have the green, red, white, black, blue, and pumpkin. Although blue and pumpkin ash are mostly down in far southern Ontario, we're mostly dealing with green and red ash as well as white and black in this sort of area as well. This is the current area, quarantine zone for emerald ash borer. So, you know, we're Manitoba around Winnipeg, so they can handle some cold. Unfortunately, City of Thunder Bay, as well as roughly the most northern collection that the MNRF has brought to my attention was north of Sault Ste. Marie, about 80 kilometers north at this point. So that's as far north as they have gone so far. And then essentially from Windsor all the way to Quebec City, they're very prominent, and even out in the eastern maritime provinces as well. So in a open tree, you're looking for types of branch flagging. So overall crown dieback is a good symptom. Things like epicormic shoots, which are essentially, I like to think of them as a sort of last-ditch effort for that tree. So once you see the epicormic shoots, the tree's not doing good anyways, and that's true with all different types of trees. Epicormic shoots are different than water sprouts that you found in apples and things like that, but they're sort of new growths that sort of come out of the boles of the trees in order to replace the area around there. Bark cracking is another thing. These beetles, the larvae will burrow underneath the bark in the cambium layer, which is that nice nutrient-rich area that's full of sugars and things that the tree is using for support, and essentially they dry out that area, and the bark starts to crack and peel away. Woodpecker feeding is probably the easiest way to detect. So this is an EAB exit hole. It is this one right here, in the green, and then the woodpecker feeding hole is in the red. I tend to say that the woodpeckers know they're there before we do, and they're pretty easy once the woodpeckers start going after the tree. You can see it. So this is actually the woodlot across from my house, and this is an ash tree right here, and you can see, I think this was taken really early spring. I want to say really early April. I took these photos, and you can see that the woodpeckers actually slough off the bark from the tree here, so it looks like a very different color than your normal, like, darker gray bark, and so it's pretty easy to see. And you can see the woodpecker holes that they've actually gone and pulled out with larvae that are in here. This tree is probably about 40 centimeters in CDH, so 40 centimeter diameter. It's a massive tree, so there's probably thousands and thousands of beetles in this tree. Here's another good example. You can actually see some of the epicormic shoots that come out here. This is an epicormic shoot. So you wouldn't expect to see little branches down on the bole of the tree, and that's what those epicormic shoots are. So when it comes to management, I had a bunch of different types of management options. You know, you can use prison traps for early detection and those kinds of things. But essentially right now, we're moving away from the detection side of management to more of the silvicultural side. So if you were to do a web search of different silviculture methods to deal with emerald ash borer, it's going to tell you mostly to start culling the ash out of your property. Yeah.
So, in my bush, I got a lot of dead ash, but some are coming back because of the parasitic wasps that they introduced on St. Joe's Island.
Yes.
Yes, they're so small you can't see them. But I've got some young ash that are okay. So
Yeah.
they're-
But the thing though is those big ash trees that the wasps are not going to have an impact. If the wasps are there essentially to save the smaller ash.
Yeah.
So the big ash are just going to be essentially breeding grounds for emerald ash borer. So
The big ones, they're already dead.
yeah, and that's the unfortunate thing. The very large ones, they're already dead. They're already going to start falling over soon. So that's why talking about if you have ash in the property, something like that, it would be best to start to cull them, use them for firewood and things like that, but don't transport them anywhere. If you can keep it close by, the best method. But to allow those regeneration to start happening.
They actually quarantined my bush.
Oh, they did?
Yeah.
They give you compensation for that?
So I'll discuss the parasitoid program here. So the parasitoid program that they're sort of releasing right now, the native wasps, they were found were more generalist wasps. They're only really making an impact about 3% parasitism rate, which isn't very large. So what they ended up doing was they went back to China and Russia, the US did. They went back to China and Russia and they found 3 different wasps that were host specific. So that means these wasps only sort of go after emerald ash borer, with the exception of Boobius, which is more of a, it prefers like given the choice, and they've done these sorts of exercises where experiments where they'll see what hosts can be developed on. The egg parasitoid can develop on 3 native repressed species. There are 3 native species. However, given the choice, they're always going to go to emerald ash borer if available. The Tetracycus, which is the wasp at the top here, it is probably about the same size of, like I would say a grain of rice is bigger than it. So it's a very small, tiny wasp, but that's one of the things that they're using in order to map these insects. So this is part of the parasitoid program. They released essentially across Ontario and in Sault Ste. Marie, we're actually starting to breed a lot of these wasps so that we can release them into the wild. And we're going back and also collecting wasps that we've already released. So the ones you mentioned, St. Joe's Island, they actually, we found them off of St. Joe's Island, which is good. So they're actually in the population.
I'm off the island.
Oh, okay.
Probably 6-7 kilometers from it.
Yeah.
So they migrated.
Yeah, so actually they migrated about 100 kilometers off the island so far.
Okay.
So they've actually moved quite a ways, and that's a really good thing that that that's happening. So you know Taylor, I think you're Taylor Scarlett.
Taylor helps me in my bush, he helps Pat.
Yeah. So essentially that's sort of emerald ash borer and what is going on. Yeah.
So when the ash are dead, where's emerald ash borer going to go? What's going to happen? Are they going to collapse? Or are they going to find a different species?
No. So emerald ash borer are specific host species as well. So they need ash. So what we're hoping is that the whole population will collapse. And then right now, actually, the Canadian National Seed Collection is collecting ash seedlings. So, or not ash seedlings, ash seeds, in order to preserve them for the next 50 years or so, and then eventually, hopefully, be able to reintroduce ash onto plants. Now that they have a predator introduced as well, they might have that predator-prey mentality. So if the emerald ash borer gets too high, then the predator will drop the population. But right now, essentially, we're waiting for that first initial wave to go through, and essentially, unfortunately, all ash are going to die in that wave. It might happen where some of the northern Ontario pockets of black ash in the boreal forest might be able to hang around, but we're still, emerald ash borer hasn't got that far north in order for us to understand those populations. But for the most part in southern Ontario, ash is not looking good. You know, even now that it's been introduced into Oregon, you know, they're worried about the western species as well. So that happened last year, and they think it came over through planted trees. So there's a schoolyard that it was found, and these trees were basically decimated. So they're trying to make sure that that doesn't happen, or they are doing aggressive management in order to get rid of them over there. But unfortunately for most of Ontario and southern Ontario especially, ash are most likely going to all be extinct except for little shrub ashes that sort of sprout out from the base of the trees.
That's going to be my next question, is what is the smallest diameter that the emerald ash borer attacks? So I've seen, you know, anything from 4 inches down or up is dead.
Yeah, so when I was doing my master's and in southern Ontario, and I found a stick that's about the size of my pinky, and you can see the outside of it. It has you can see where the egg is, and you can actually see where the gallery is. So that's the smallest I've ever found. So about the size of, about a centimeter in diameter. Yeah, we'll find it. Okay, I'm going to run through oak wilt pretty quick. So oak wilt is an invasive fungus that has been around for since about the 40s in the U.S. However, it was first detected in Niagara Falls this year, as well as Springwater Township as well this year. The Niagara Falls detection, we suspect was probably here for 2 or 3 years because the trees that we were dealing with were dead. Whereas the Springwater detection is a new detection. But those are the 2 occurrences in Ontario, and those are big concerns to the oak industry. And as well as forest habitats.
So where's Springwater Township?
Just sort of north of Barrie. Yes. So oak wilt is a vascular fungus that is found in oak trees. The fungal hyphae, so the fungal little tendrils, they clog up the vascular tissue of the xylem part of the tree, and the oak trees essentially try to block that fungus from getting any further and eventually girdle itself, unfortunately. So the combined basically fungus clogging up the xylem as well as the oak itself trying to defend it, essentially causes the mortality of those trees. This fungus is one that we're talking about large style trees that can die within 2 to 6 weeks of infection. So if someone detecting it, it can die quite rapidly. There's a couple different ways of transmission. Root grafting. So this is a photo down here, an aerial photo of where oak wilt has come into an area, and you can see the oak leaves that are starting to die around the edges, and this essentially is all through root grafting. So one of the main things with treatment for oak wilt is to basically put in either take a shovel and dig a trench around your infected area so it doesn't go into other trees, or they have the large 6-foot vibrating blades that they attach to a tractor and essentially cut the soil around these trees. So after the spread of oak wilt and you remove the oak tree, the actual oak wilt can stay in the roots for a number of years, so several years after. So monitoring usually comes into play to make sure that the oak wilt doesn't spread any further. Bark cracking from the fruiting bodies. So essentially the wilt develops in the sapwood of the tree. And once it kills the tree, it essentially makes this what's called a pressure pad or a foot that pushes the bark ever so slightly outwards, making a crack because it's now dried out the tree. And this is actually from the trees in Niagara, and these are the size of the trees here, and you can see the pressure pads formed here. So what this fungus does is it spreads through the roots, but it also, it attracts something else in order to disperse it. So knitted beetles really like anything that smells sweet. They're all over the place. They're mostly an agricultural species pests. They like corn and different grains and rotting fruit and fruits and things like that. But this pressure pad makes a really fruity smell. So once they crack the bark, they send out this sort of wine-like smell in order to attract these beetles. I've heard some people refer to it as smelling like juicy fruit gum. So if you've ever smelled juicy fruit, that's apparently what it smells like. And these beetles tend to go to the pressure pad and feed on the spores and the fungus there, and they get covered in all these spores. And then what the problem is with that is if there's tree wounding that happens, they'll also go to sap flows and things like that. So they'll be found on different sap flows, and that's essentially how they can spread from an infected tree to a non-infected tree.
So the examples you've shown are on the base, but the beetles can move it up the tree?
Yes. So things like storm damage and things like that, it can happen way up in the crown. So that's something that the beetles can go to if there's a sap flow that is actually occurring. Oaks, whenever you wound them, they tend to secrete sap. And so this one here, this construction, like this is from, I think, a machine sort of brushing up against it, any type of fruiting. So when we're talking to individuals, we're stressing right now is to not prune oak trees between basically April and October, because that's when the beetles are in their high flight season. So only prune them in the winter months when there is no beetle activity to prevent them from growing. Unfortunately, the storm damage is really, 1 minute, okay. The storm damage is really challenging, but it's, we're trying to basically prevent them from spreading as much. Another big one I want to touch on is firewood transmission. So we're suspecting, because the oak wilt vines in Canada are about 100 kilometers each from an oak wilt detection in the USA. So we're suspecting that someone has brought it to Canada through firewood is the most likely scenario. However, we can't prove that, but it's pretty much what the going theory is right now. Because if an oak tree dies, the next year is when the fungal spore mat will grow, and that is essentially, so if you cut the tree down right away, transport it to wherever you're going, the spore mat will just sort of escape from there, and then the individuals will carry it on to the next species. Yeah.
Not about oak wilt, but I know we only have 1 minute.
That's
And I was
okay.
wondering if you have a comment about the impact of the spotted letterfly on maple sugar bushes. I know that's not in Canada yet, but it's kind of coming.
So one of the big things we're worried about is it going into the vineyards and things like that. But maple trees are one of the hosts that it can survive on. I haven't heard in the States whether it's being found on specific maple stands yet, but it is something that it can survive on. So most of the spotted lanternfly information is directed towards the sort of the vine line or vineyard side of things, and fruit trees and those kinds of things. So essentially, that's pretty much what I wanted to get at. Some photos that we took of oak wilt as well. These are some other diseases that you can find. You can actually find these in most trees. So bacterial leaf scorching, you can find in maple stands as well, and same with anthracnose. Oak wilt tends to have sort of a fading of the leaf. So that's sort of the difference between the two. The other ones are, and then frost damage as well. So these are 2 places that if you want to report, these are great places to report to. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency, as well as the Invasive Species Hotline, are 2 great places to report to. The Invasive Species Hotline is monitored 24 hours a day. So one thing I want to add, if you are going to report something, please take a photo of it. A photo of like the whole area, like a zoomed out photo, and a photo of the small symptom that you're looking at. Because that helps people like myself in order to identify certain things that are going on. So thank you very much. If you have any more questions, you can get in touch with me, and we can help you with any sort of specific. Thanks.
Just very quick on that, I do have on my phone a couple of apps that I use. So there's one app called EdMaps, you can download it. And the great thing about that is you take the pictures that David was talking about, you upload them, and there's actually experts on the other end of the line saying, oh, you've got one of these, or don't worry, you've got one of those. The other one is iNaturalist. There's a lot of people looking at whatever gets posted there. So if you don't know what it is, take a picture of it, send it into one of those apps, and figure it out. The reason why it's important is that if you're the first known instance of spotted lanternfly in a maple stand, that's when they go, oh, the detection of oak wilt in Springwater Township that happened because someone said this doesn't look right. So don't just assume that nature's doing something different. Say, oh, nature's doing something different. Figure it out. Anyway, next, thank you very much, David. We've got to move on to the next session. So